Okay, welcome back to our next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to discuss how to conduct the risk assessment, which is one of the early parts of ISO 14971. And the word risk assessment is, of course, a defined term, defined as the overall process comprising of a risk analysis and a risk evaluation, which are further defined terms down here. So the risk assessment is the combination of these two. It's the risk analysis plus the risk evaluation. The risk analysis is identifying the hazard and then defining the risk in terms of the probability of harm and the severity of that harm. So it's defined as the systematic use of available information to identify the hazard and estimate the risk. Estimate the risk is just describe it by severity and probability. When they say the systematic use of available information, what they mean by that is that you're meant to basically pull from different sources of information to estimate risk, and it's quite a broad spectrum of resources you're meant to pull from. Like you can pull from stuff such as scientific literature, you can pull from stuff like clinical studies, you can pull information from history of previous devices, you can also pull information from consensus standards. For instance, if you look through IEC 60601, you'll see it's full of basically tests of how to design electrical medical equipment to prevent electric shock and to prevent excessive temperatures, etc. And each of those tests is essentially a risk control measure that acts as a risk control measure for some hazard, and you can use that as a base, as a tool to identify, look at the test and ask what is the hazard that this test in IEC 60601 acts to mitigate, and hence IEC 60601 is acting as one of these sources of information. Now, the other source of information that people heavily rely on is, of course, expert opinion, and that'll effectively be the opinion of your own design team members. And the other definition we have here is risk evaluation, which is the process of comparing the estimated risk against risk criteria to determine if the risk is acceptable or not. We'll dive into that in more detail in the next lesson, but it's basically just saying, is this risk acceptable or is it not? Now, coming back to the risk assessment, generally to do the risk assessment, you draw it out in a big table. So we will draw the table below and we're going to identify and assess one risk for the AED, which we've had in our previous examples. And you can see in the headers there, I have risk ID, which is going to be what we're going to use for our design traceability. Then we identify our hazards, which is the first part of this. Then we're going to ask what is the foreseeable sequence of events that will lead to a hazardous situation that could cause harm to either people or property. And then we're basically going to look at what is the probability of that harm actually occurring. And if that harm were to occur, what is its severity? And then based on these two, we'll ask, is this risk acceptable or not acceptable? So let's now work through a quick example to get a better understanding of what this is. If we were starting this process, we would start with risk number 1, and then we'll say our hazard here is energy, and let's say it's electrical energy. Now we ask, what is a foreseeable sequence of events that could lead to the hazard of electrical energy inducing harm? And what we could say is number 1, a person goes into cardiac arrest. Okay, number 2, a layperson uses the AED to treat them. 3, they touch the electronics or cable or patient during pulse delivery. The layperson receives an electric shock. Okay, and then so we can see here the foreseeable sequence of events. It's best to see that as a literal sequence of events of first this happens, second this happens, third this, fourth this, etc. The hazardous situation, it kind of always ends up being a bit of a summary of the foreseeable sequence of events and the hazard itself. So for the hazardous situation, I'm going to put down operator electric shock. So I'm going to give it a title. So this is the title, and then I'll give it just a slightly longer description of the operator is shocked during pulse delivery from the enclosure, cables, or patient. Okay, the next thing that we have to do here is ask ourselves, what is the harm that occurs from this hazardous situation? And that is simply just electric shock to the operator. And I'll just put down electric shock for short. And then the next thing we do is we ask ourselves, what is the probability of occurrence and the severity of this harm? And we have to assume that no risk control measures have been implemented yet. So we're going to say the probability is high. The reason why we say high here is because we have no data to back this up. And this will be very common during the start of a design. And basically, when you don't have data to back up what is the actual probability, you basically overestimate probability to be much more likely So as a result, we say high. And then when it comes to severity, we'll say it's serious. Now we'll break into, in the next few lessons, just why we've used these terms. And then the last piece of the puzzle here, we say, is this acceptable or not? That's the risk evaluation. So we'll say not acceptable. So that is it in a nutshell, and that would say be the first risk in our risk assessment, and then we would just keep going. We would keep identifying more hazards, and we should generate a large table, and usually people do it out in Excel where you have many risks, and then of course we will, in the next step of this process, look at each risk and ask ourselves, what are the risk control measures we should introduce to reduce the likelihood of this risk happening, and if we can also reduce the severity of if the risk were to happen. The other thing I'll point out to you here is, say, so that is design traceability. This part here is generally referred to as the preliminary hazard analysis, and then when we get to this part, this is the risk analysis. All of this together is the risk assessment. Okay, I'll leave that lesson there, and I shall see you in the next.